Sometimes the quietest towns carry the deepest shadows, and sometimes all it takes is a flicker of lantern light to reveal the truth. In Apple Hollow, memories linger like mist, and even a forgotten letter can change everything. As dusk settles and secrets rise, one question remains: how well do we ever know the past or those we choose to forget? Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. Death at the Harvest Festival. The letter had arrived on thick, ivory paper, tucked inside an envelope that smelled faintly of dried leaves and clove. Jessica Fletcher ran her fingers along the embossed return address, Apple Hollow Festival Committee. A small town name she hadn't heard in years, not since Evelyn Pierce, her college roommate and once devoted pen pal, had last mentioned her family orchard, nestled somewhere along the old New Hampshire roads. She unfolded the letter and smiled at the warm, looping handwriting. Dearest Jessica, it's been far too long. Apple Hollow is hosting our Harvest Festival again, with pies, music, and perhaps a bit of gossip for dessert. We'd be honored if you would join us as a guest judge in the pie contest. No one understands apples quite like a writer from Maine. With affection, Evelyn. Jessica hesitated, letter in hand. Festivals weren't usually her rhythm anymore, but there was something about the timing, the shift in air, the need for quiet. She looked out her window at the first amber leaf drifting down. Perhaps it was time to see Evelyn again, and something told her Apple Hollow might offer more than just apple tart. The ride through New England was slow and winding, the kind of road that asked you to notice. Birch trees flamed gold, and sugar maples bled crimson along the hillsides. Jessica leaned into the rhythm of it, letting the hum of tires and the scent of wood smoke ease her thoughts. She remembered festivals like these from childhood, the caramel apples, the fiddlers, the quiet pride of small communities dressing themselves in celebration. But Apple Hollow was unfamiliar, a name only half remembered through Evelyn's stories, a town she suspected, where tradition ran deep and change didn't come without friction. As her cab finally turned down a narrow lane flanked by hand-painted signs and garlands of corn husks, Jessica felt the hush of something about to begin, or perhaps stir again. She adjusted her scarf, folded her hands in her lap, and looked ahead. Jessica stepped out of the car to the sound of fiddles tuning in the distance and the scent of cinnamon in the air. The village square had been transformed into a quilt of color. Pumpkins, hay bales, and baskets of windfall apples greeted her at every corner. A large banner fluttered above the church steps. Welcome to the Apple Hollow Harvest Festival. Jessica Fletcher, a voice rang out. A tall man in a wool coat strode forward, arms outstretched. Tom Ellison, he said warmly, clasping her hand, mayor, unofficial welcomer, and keeper of all things celebratory. He led her through the square, pointing out the cider press, the quilting contest, and the bake sale. Everything sparkled with community pride, yet Jessica noticed the polite restraint in the smiles offered by some committee members as they nodded in greeting. Behind the booths, whispered conversations paused when she approached. A glance between two women lingered a moment too long, and though the laughter rang clearly through the air, something about it felt rehearsed. Jessica had learned to hear silence better than words, and here, beneath the bunting and the cheer, silence had already begun to speak. They passed a booth draped in white linen and fine-cut flowers, oddly grand for a village fair. At its center stood a woman with silver-streaked hair, impeccably dressed in tweed and pearls, handing out jars of apple preserves labeled Canfield Orchards, Est 1892. That's Lydia Canfield, Tom murmured. Came back 6 months ago after nearly 3 decades away, bought back the family estate and stirred half the town in the process. Jessica watched as Lydia accepted a compliment with a cool smile, then turned to speak with a young woman who quickly dropped her gaze. There was an unmistakable edge in Lydia's voice, the kind that did not ask but expected. She was quite the name in her day, Tom continued, and quite the storm when she returned. Some think she's here to restore the family's name. Others think she's here to rewrite it. Jessica said nothing, but as she watched Lydia's elegant fingers pause on a jar's lid, she noticed how the people around her shifted, a step back, a glance away. Not fear, perhaps, but old discomfort, barely hidden. Apple Hollow was proud, but pride, Jessica had learned, could turn to grievance with very little prodding. Jessica wandered alone now, weaving past booths filled with preserves, maple syrup, and hand-stitched quilts. A child with a painted face ran past her, laughing, followed by the gentle creak of wagon wheels from a hayride nearby. There was a certain charm to it, the kind born not from spectacle, but from earnestness. Yet charm, Jessica knew, could coexist with memory. And memory in places like this never left quietly. She paused beside the scarecrow competition, where each entry stood like a silent sentinel. One wore a faded flannel shirt she recognized from earlier, the same color Glenn Hartley, the schoolteacher, had been wearing. Another had an uncanny resemblance to Lydia Canfield, down to the string of beads around its neck. Jessica raised a brow. A group of older women whispered behind a nearby jam stall. One of them, Nora Bell if the name tag was accurate, caught Jessica's eye and offered a smile that was polite but guarded. "So many returns this year," Nora said mildly. "The leaves aren't the only things changing color." Jessica thanked her and continued on. Near the cider booth, a nervous young girl dropped a stack of entry forms. Jessica bent to help. One form was smudged with cider and something stickier, red, almost like paint, or perhaps jam. She handed it back without a word, but the moment lodged in her mind like a small seed. The judging tent smelled like heaven, cinnamon, butter, roasted pecans. Jessica stood beside two other judges, Reverend Markley, who grinned beneath a mustache dusted with powdered sugar, and Maisie Trumbull, a former fall queen turned festival chairwoman. Maisie gave Jessica a firm handshake and a smile just shy of genuine. "We're honored to have a published author judging our little competition," she said. "I hope you're not expecting Parisian flair." "I'll settle for a flaky crust," Jessica replied warmly. Their conversation was interrupted by Glenn Hartley, who approached to deliver an entry form with a barely audible, "Excuse me." He avoided Jessica's eyes, but she noticed how his fingers trembled slightly as he set down his pie, spiced pear, laced with something sharper. "I didn't know Glenn baked," Maisie murmured, lips tight. "Some talents stay hidden," Jessica said softly. At the far table, Lydia Canfield arrived with a glass pie dish, flanked by a young assistant. She spoke little, but her presence drew the attention of every booth nearby. Jessica took a bite of the first entry. It was delicious, but her thoughts weren't on flavor. They were on the subtle frost that had settled between these neighbors, and the sense that something was quietly unraveling. The morning came with a golden haze and the scent of mulled cider hanging in the breeze. Jessica strolled through the village green, where volunteers were fastening banners between maple trees and arranging bushels of apples beneath burlap cloths. Everything looked picture-perfect, yet the rhythm felt off. She paused near the booth where a group of women adjusted a cornucopia display. Their conversation halted abruptly as she approached. One woman offered a warm greeting, the others smiled just a second too late. Jessica returned the courtesy, but noted how their eyes followed her, not with curiosity, but with wariness. A man on a ladder adjusting bunting snapped at a younger assistant for no clear reason, his voice louder than it needed to be. Near the pumpkin weigh-in, Two committee members exchanged what looked like an argument disguised as logistics. Jessica wasn't surprised. Small towns could be lovely on the outside, but they were also dense with memory. What looked like cheer often carried years of tension just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. She moved on slowly, her pace thoughtful. It wasn't hostility exactly, but something had cracked beneath Apple Hollow's festival polish, something very old. Near the eastern end of the green, the Canfield family apple booth stood like a relic from a grander age. Crisp linen, polished copper pots, glass jars filled with preserves and jellies arranged with military precision. Behind it, Lydia Canfield, wrapped in a dark green shawl, surveyed her stall as though it were a courtroom. Jessica approached just in time to hear her coolly remind a young volunteer to mind the placement of the signage. Symmetry matters. A passerby murmured something about Lydia's taste being more Boston than barn, which drew a faint smirk from another woman at the cider booth. Lydia heard. Her jaw stiffened, but she didn't turn. Instead, she selected a jar from the display and adjusted it by exactly half an inch. Jessica watched the scene unfold, not the words but the tension around them. People walked by the Canfield booth quickly, offering nods without stopping. Some ignored it entirely. The Canfields had once ruled Apple Hollow's orchards, and Lydia, it seemed, had returned to reclaim that ground. But from the chilly air around her booth, Jessica sensed that not all the apples in her cart would be welcome, especially not the bruised ones. The quilt tent was quieter, a patchwork world of texture and memory. Jessica drifted between displays, her fingers brushing over rows of tiny hand-stitched stars, each one a story. She found Nora Bell seated near the back, adjusting a log cabin quilt with delicate precision. A small placard read, "In memory of Thomas Bell, 1974. "Beautiful work," Jessica said gently. Nora looked up and offered a faint smile. "You must be the writer. Evelyn mentioned you'd be coming." They spoke a while about fabric, threads, and the old art of quilting, but it didn't take long before the conversation turned. "It's strange," Nora said softly, glancing toward the edge of the tent, "seeing Lydia here again. Her father caused, well, more than one quiet scandal in his day." Jessica tilted her head. "Something the papers didn't cover." Nora chuckled without warmth. "Oh, the papers covered it, just not the part that mattered." Jessica waited, but Nora, like a seasoned librarian, knew how to close a chapter without slamming it shut. "We all have long memories around here," she added, folding a corner carefully. "Some just don't admit it." Jessica nodded and thanked her, but she left the tent with a prickle of unease, and a name she wouldn't forget: Thomas Bell. By midday, the Scarecrow contest had gathered a modest crowd near the orchard's edge. Children ran ahead to admire the outlandish figures. One wore sunglasses and a leather jacket. Another carried a rake like a sword. Jessica stood beside the judging panel, observing the entries with polite interest. Mayor Ellison made a cheerful remark about how creativity bloomed best when pie was on the line. But it wasn't the scarecrows that caught Jessica's attention. Glenn Hartley, the schoolteacher, stood stiffly beside his student's submission, a rustic figure with patch-patched overalls and a straw-stuffed satchel. Maisie Trumbull approached from the other side, her arms crossed, smile thin. "Well," she said, "at least it looks like someone put in effort this year." Glenn turned to her with a tight jaw. "It's not a competition. It's always a competition," Maisie replied, then turned to wave at the mayor. Their voices had been low, civil, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Jessica noted the way Glenn's hand clenched the brim of his hat, the flash of something raw in his expression before he stepped away. She made a mental note, not about the scarecrow, but about the silence that followed it. Later that afternoon, Jessica found herself beneath the old oak tree, where photographs of past Harvest Festival royalty were displayed. At the center hung a sepia image of Maisie Trumbull, radiant in her crown, the Fall Queen of 1983. Those were the days, came Maisie's voice behind her, when the biggest scandal was a pie missing from the judge's table. Jessica turned, smiling. And now, Maisie shrugged. Now the air smells like memory, and not all of it sweet. They walked slowly together along the booth path, past ribbons fluttering from garlands and a choir warming up near the chapel. She walks around like she owns the soil, Maisie said abruptly. Lydia? Maisie nodded. And maybe she does. But it doesn't mean the rest of us forgot how that soil got taken in the first place. Jessica waited, giving her space. She never looked back after she left. Not a call, not a letter. And now she's here with her jars and her silk scarves like nothing happened. Maisie paused, voice tightening. I don't mind pride, I mind revision. Jessica caught the flicker behind the bitterness, something bruised, not angry. And perhaps, she thought, the past hadn't stayed buried at all. As the sun dipped lower, Jessica stopped by the cider stand, drawn less by thirst and more by the need for quiet. The crowd had thinned slightly. The music softened. Sheriff Eli Coulter leaned on the wooden counter with the ease of someone who knew when not to speak. He tipped his hat as Jessica approached. Afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher. Sheriff. He poured her a glass of warm cider and handed it to her without a word. She sipped, grateful for the quiet company. After a moment she said, "This town seems beautiful on the surface." He nodded. Most towns do. But Eli turned to watch a group of teenagers laughing near the pumpkin patch. But underneath, we've got roots tangled in things most folks pretend aren't there. Jessica studied his profile. He looked younger than she'd expected for a sheriff, but his eyes carried weariness. Lydia Canfield's return seems to have stirred something, she said gently. Eli's jaw moved, but he didn't speak right away. Then a lot of people in this town carry grudges like family heirlooms. They don't dust them off until someone makes them. Jessica waited. Eli looked at her. Just be careful what you ask, Mrs. Fletcher. Not everyone here wants the past unwrapped. Jessica gave a faint nod, finishing her cider. The wind had picked up. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime clattered. The sheriff tipped his hat again and walked off, leaving behind not threat, but something closer to sorrow. The light had changed, no longer gold, but a soft burnished amber. Twilight fell over Apple Hollow like a hush, settling across a crowded room. The bonfire, built high with carefully stacked applewood, crackled to life at the center of the village green. Flames licked upward, throwing shadows across the gathered faces, some familiar, others watchful. Jessica accepted a cup of mulled cider from a young girl with cinnamon on her sleeves and took a seat on one of the hay bales, arranged in a wide, uneven circle around the fire. The warmth was welcome, but more than that, it drew people closer, and in closer spaces, truths often slipped out. Laughter rose in small pockets. Someone tuned a fiddle. Sheriff Coulter stood off to the side, arms crossed loosely. Lydia Canfield had not yet appeared, but her absence lingered like perfume left behind in a closed room. Jessica watched as townspeople exchanged greetings and clinks of tin mugs, but it was the silences between those greetings that told her more. Glenn Hartley kept to himself. Nora Bell offered smiles that didn't stretch to her eyes, and Maisie, ever poised, sat just near enough to the fire, but never close to Glenn. The fire warmed their hands, but it hadn't thawed the past. When Lydia finally arrived, the crowd shifted subtly, not in greeting, but in calculation. She walked alone, dressed in a tailored coat, the color of rusted maple leaves, and carried a wineglass instead of cider. Without preamble, she stepped to the front of the bonfire circle and lifted her glass. "To the Canfield legacy," she said. "To tradition, to perseverance, and to remembering what this town once stood for." The applause that followed was polite, brief, and unmistakably restrained. A few clapped out of habit. Others, like Maisie, kept their hands folded in their lap. Glenn Hartley didn't move at all. Jessica studied the moment. The speech had been short, not grand, but sharp-edged. As though Lydia hadn't meant to inspire, but to remind. A man near Jessica muttered something under his breath. The woman beside him nudged him in warning. The children, unbothered, laughed as someone threw a handful of dried leaves into the fire, sending sparks into the night. Lydia raised her glass again, eyes scanning the crowd, not searching for agreement, but measuring its absence. Jessica sipped her cider. The tension had deepened, quiet as snowfall, invisible to those who refused to feel it. The fire's glow grew brighter as the sky darkened. Jessica felt the need for air, or perhaps distance. She rose, murmured a polite word to Mayor Ellison, and wandered toward the orchard path that curved behind the community green. The night smelled of bark, apples, and moss. Leaves crunched gently underfoot. She had always found these moments between daylight and dark to be the most revealing, when people forgot they were being watched. It was there, at the far edge of the firelight's reach, that she caught sight of Lydia again. This time, not alone. Glenn Hartley stood with her, his shoulders stiff, voice low. The conversation was not cordial, though she could not yet hear the posture of both told her everything. Lydia's chin raised in icy defiance, Glenn's jaw set tight with years of something unsaid. Jessica stopped at the edge of the path, partially obscured by a twisted apple branch. She had no intention of eavesdropping. Not exactly, but sometimes silence invited you to listen in its place. The fire behind her cracked. Before her, a different fire had begun, not of kindling but of memory reignited. Jessica stilled, her breath barely moving, the leaves beneath her feet no louder than dust. "I warned you," Glenn said, his voice strained. This land was meant to stay untouched. Lydia's tone cut through the air like frost on a window pane. "Warned me, Glenn, your father signed the papers before he died. The orchard was part of the Canfield holding long before your family ever set foot here." Glenn stepped forward, the tension in his frame visible even from where Jessica stood. "That land was leased, not sold. And you know it, you know what was buried there, and why your father wanted it kept quiet." There was a pause. Jessica strained to hear. A bird rustled in the nearby branches. "You were never meant to see those records," Lydia said, softer now but no less cutting. "You and your schoolhouse sermons, clinging to principles no one else remembers." "I remember," Glenn snapped. "And so does Nora. You can buy back your family's name, Lydia, but you can't rewrite what happened." Jessica felt the world still around her. The orchard, the lease, something hidden, something both old and recent. Then Lydia's voice came again, quieter, but with something final in its edges. "You don't understand what silence costs, and you never did." Glenn didn't reply. Jessica waited another heartbeat. Then quietly she stepped back into the trees, the words echoing behind her like the fading chords of a song never meant for an audience. The warmth of the bonfire was almost jarring as Jessica returned, the hum of chatter a sharp contrast to the orchard's icy truths. She moved quietly to her seat, mindful of the cider sloshing gently in her cup, her mind heavy with names and phrases that refused to sit still. Lydia had returned before her. She sat now on a bench close to the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her glass refilled. But something in her posture had shifted, less statuesque, more tightly wound. Glenn, meanwhile, stood just outside the circle, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the flames. If anyone noticed the electricity that passed between them, no one said a word. Jessica glanced around the group. Nora was talking to Reverend Markley in low tones. Maisie had her attention fixed on a pair of children dancing awkwardly near the hay bales. Mayor Ellison was stirring the embers with a long stick, a forced smile on his lips. The festival still carried on, but the air had cooled, not by weather but by the weight of unspoken things. Jessica sipped her cider again. Some stories she knew didn't wait for telling. They told themselves in posture and silence. The call went out for the children's lantern walk, a beloved tradition where paper lanterns were lit and carried through the village, soft stars against the dusk. Parents clustered to help light wicks. Small hands reached eagerly. Jessica remained seated, watching the glow of flickering lights float past like fireflies. A few feet away, Lydia rose from her bench, smoothing her coat with a deliberate gesture. She glanced toward Glenn, who did not look back. Then, without a word, she turned and began walking away from the fire, not toward the lantern path, but into the darker stretch beyond the cider barn. Jessica's gaze followed her, her writer's instinct tightening. It wasn't just the direction, it was the solitude. Behind her, laughter continued, bright and untroubled. But in that laughter, Jessica caught the contrast too sharply. Lydia's departure had been unnoticed, unaccompanied, and too purposeful. Just before she disappeared behind the trees, Lydia paused. For a moment, she looked back. Jessica couldn't see her face clearly, but someone else was watching too. A silhouette just beyond the orchard fence. Not a child, not part of the parade. Jessica straightened slightly. Her cider had gone cold, and somewhere in the dark, a lantern went out. The morning broke clear and bright, with the kind of autumn light that made everything seem sharper. Golden leaves, crisp shadows, and the scent of baked apples floating in from the kitchen window. Jessica stirred from her room at Evelyn's cottage, the old floorboards creaking softly beneath her slippers. From the town green below came the early bustle of festival preparations, laughter, the clatter of folding tables, and the musical clang of crockery being set in place. It was the morning of the pie judging, a centerpiece of the harvest festival, and for Jessica, a welcome return to simplicity, or so she believed. She dressed in quiet reflection, her thoughts still lingering on the lantern walk, and Lydia's solitary disappearance into the trees. The image of that single extinguished lantern had clung to her through the night. As she tied her scarf and prepared to walk down toward the judging tent, Evelyn called out, "They're already arranging the pies. You won't want to miss the pumpkin chiffon." Jessica smiled faintly and stepped outside into the sun-dappled morning. She didn't know it yet, but the pies would not be the most talked-about thing that day. The scream came just as Jessica reached the edge of the festival green. It wasn't theatrical, not the kind that makes you turn with curiosity, but short, sharp, and so raw it pierced the morning's brightness. People turned. Some began to run. Jessica followed the sound instinctively, heart tightening. Near the cider press, a small group had gathered. Sheriff Coulter was already pushing through the crowd, his expression shifting from confusion to something heavier as he approached. There, just behind the equipment shed where barrels of apples were stored, lay Lydia Canfield. Her scarf, deep burgundy and unmistakably hers, had become twisted and pulled into the exposed gears of the pressing machine. Her body, unnaturally still, rested half-curled at the base of the mechanism, one hand outstretched. A young festival volunteer sobbed nearby, her apron stained with cider and panic. "She was just there," the girl whispered. "I thought maybe she'd dropped something." Jessica stayed quiet, her gaze fixed on the scene. The machinery had been turned off hours ago. The ground was damp, leaves had been scattered in haste. But even at a glance, something about it didn't sit right. And something else, something quieter, had begun to stir. The harvest hall, once filled with the scents of cinnamon and laughter, had turned hushed and strange. The news of Lydia's death traveled with a surreal swiftness, carried not by shouts but by stunned murmurs and furtive glances. Jessica stood near the corner of the hall, observing. Conversations bloomed in pockets, each tinged with disbelief, followed quickly by the darker hue of speculation. "Slipped, most likely," someone said. "That path behind the press is always slick in the morning." Or maybe she was up early, poking where she didn't belong. Another added, "Sotto voce." Maisie Trumbull paced beside the punch bowl, not drinking, not speaking, just watching. Glenn Hartley stood by the doors, arms folded, jaw tight. And Nora Bell, her hands folded around a cup of untouched tea, sat with her back unnaturally straight, as though holding herself together by posture alone. Jessica noted it all. The fractured grief, the absence of sorrow in some corners, and the curious calm in others. It wasn't just that Lydia was dead. It was the release of something long held. Her presence had disturbed the town's fragile equilibrium, and her absence, so sudden, had reshuffled the silence. A silence Jessica no longer trusted. Sheriff Coulter found Jessica near the apple tart table, where the judging had been delayed, then quietly forgotten. "I wanted you to hear it from me," he said. "Looks like an accident. The scarf got caught in the gears. She must have slipped. Early morning dew makes that back path treacherous." Jessica nodded, but didn't speak right away. She had long since learned that people often filled silences with their own doubts. "And the machinery?" she asked. "Wasn't running," he admitted. "Which makes it odd, but those old cogs can still shift if someone leans on them. They're heavy, unforgiving." Jessica sipped her tea, eyes narrowing slightly. She was meticulous, precise. Would she really go behind the press without good reason? The sheriff hesitated. Maybe she dropped something, or maybe she was meeting someone. He looked away then, toward the cider booth, now roped off with quiet authority. "We'll know more when the coroner finishes," he added. "But if I had to guess," Jessica finished for him, "you'd file it under misadventure." He nodded once, then walked off. But Jessica remained still. Her instincts, those that had saved her before, told her there were too many pieces, and they didn't yet fit. Jessica walked back toward the judging tent, but her thoughts lingered behind the cider barn and on the scarf. Burgundy wool, thick and expensive, the same one Lydia had worn earlier that week during her toast. But not the one she'd worn the night before. Jessica remembered it clearly. Lydia had draped a cream-colored shawl across her shoulders during the bonfire, its edges catching the lantern light like lace. Why change scarves before dawn? She turned this over as she wondered. It wasn't just fashion. Lydia was deliberate, even in her defiance. If she'd left the gathering alone, her mood strained and posture tense, would she really have stopped to change into something warmer, or had someone else added the scarf afterward? A small group of volunteers passed by, whispering, avoiding her gaze. She caught a phrase, "Someone must have found her first." The thought was quiet but persistent. If the scarf hadn't been there the night before, who placed it? Jessica paused near the scarecrow exhibit, where shadows played along the hay. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking not of Lydia's last steps, but of someone else's hands. Careful, rushed, perhaps not entirely sure what they were hiding. The pie judging resumed in muted tones, as though the act of tasting had become ceremonial, a gesture of resilience rather than celebration. Jessica sat beside Reverend Markley and Maisie, who said little but performed her duties with mechanical grace. She took a bite of the third entry, a traditional apple tart, well balanced, with a hint of nutmeg. The flavors triggered a thought, not culinary, but verbal. She remembered a remark from the night before, just after Lydia's tense toast. Glenn Hartley had been speaking, not to her but near enough to be overheard, something about early deliveries and unlocked barns. Jessica put down her fork. If Lydia had gone to meet someone that morning, someone who expected her, or perhaps didn't, then the scarf could have been placed afterward, either in haste or to obscure some trace. And Glenn already up before dawn. He knew the paths, he knew the farths, he knew the cider barn. But would he have left her like that? Or was there more to his silence? Jessica glanced toward the far end of the tent. Glenn was gone. She folded her napkin slowly. There were pies to taste, but her appetite had narrowed, and her questions had begun to take shape. The Apple Hollow Library was tucked behind the post office, its clapboard exterior unchanged since the 1890s. Inside, the air smelled of dust, lemon oil, and thyme. Jessica stepped through the worn double doors just as the grandfather clock in the corner struck 11. Nora Bell looked up from her desk, teacup in hand. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said mildly, "I wondered if you'd find your way here." "I needed a quieter place to think," Jessica replied, accepting the second cup Nora had already poured. They settled in the reading corner beneath the tall window. The tea was strong and floral, just enough to cut through the morning's heaviness. "She didn't deserve what happened," Nora said after a long sip, "but that doesn't mean she didn't invite the storm." Jessica tilted her head. "Meaning, Lydia's father made a great show of legacy," Nora said, setting her cup down. "But some of us remember when that legacy came at a cost. My family leased the Northern Orchard parcel for 3 generations, until a Canfield lawyer came around with papers no one had seen before." Jessica's gaze sharpened. "And that land? Sold," Nora said. "At auction, without warning. My father died the next winter. Some things don't mend, Mrs. Fletcher, especially not with silk scarves and pie ribbons." Nora stood and motioned Jessica to follow her past the stacks and into a side room, where a rolling cart held old files, brittle manila folders, yellow documents bound with fading ribbon. She pulled one from the bottom. It was labeled Town Disputes, 1972, 1976. "Thomas was my brother," she said, voice even but hollow at the edges. "He worked for the town assessor's office. Bright boy, too principled for his own good." Jessica glanced at the folder as Nora opened it, revealing maps, letters, and a photo of a young man with a wide smile and clear eyes. He discovered inconsistencies in the Canfield property filings, raised questions. The next month, he was reassigned to desk work. 2 months later, he fell from the bridge behind the mill. Jessica looked up. "Officially," Nora added, "a night accident, slipped on wet leaves, and unofficially, a warning, or a silencing. Hard to say after all this time, but Lydia's father made certain no charges were ever brought. The files were closed within days." Jessica gently closed the folder. The past hadn't vanished in Apple Hollow. It had simply been catalogued and left to sleep, until someone, perhaps unwisely, stirred it again. Outside the schoolhouse, The laughter of children echoed faintly from the playground as Jessica spotted Glenn Hartley unlocking the gate to the side entrance. He looked surprised to see her but did not appear unwelcoming. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, "if you're looking for students, they're long gone. I'm just staying late, paperwork." "I'm looking for you," she said, then smiled. "Only for a conversation, I promise." He hesitated, then held the door open. Careful of the step, they walked together along the empty hallway, the air thick with chalk and memory. "Rough day," he said, stuffing a folder under his arm. "Lydia's death has touched everyone," Jessica offered. Glenn shrugged. "She was a presence, I'll give her that." There was something too neutral in his tone, not cold, but studied. "You were seen arguing with her the night before," Jessica said gently. "We weren't arguing," he replied. "We were finishing something old." Jessica noted how he looked away when he said it. "She hurt people," he added. "Not just me, and not all of us forgave as easily as she assumed." She let the silence stretch. "Forgiveness," she said, "has a way of waiting until it's too late." Glenn didn't answer. They paused near the bulletin board, where flyers for reading nights and a faded photograph of last year's Harvest Festival hung crookedly. Jessica glanced at the photo, then at Glenn. "You once proposed to her, didn't you?" He blinked, then laughed. Not with amusement, but the dry sound of someone exhaling something long held. "She told you?" he asked. "No," Jessica said. "But grief has its own fingerprints, and yours didn't feel like a stranger's." He leaned against the wall, arms folded. "It was a long time ago. I was foolish." She was restless. Her eyes were already on Boston before I could finish the question. "Did you ever speak of it again?" "She left the next morning." Jessica nodded slowly. "And when she returned, she acted as though it never happened. Said she came back for the land, to reclaim her family's name. But she looked at me like I was a misplaced chapter." There was a pause. "I didn't hate her," Glenn said. "But I hated who I became after she left, and maybe that's worse." Jessica said nothing, but her mind turned. Bosom wolf that never bled, and motives that wore civility like a shield. The festival pavilion was a flurry of motion. Ribbons fluttered, hay bales were repositioned, and volunteers bustled between booths rehearsing tomorrow's final ceremony. Jessica spotted Maisie Trumbull arranging centerpieces near the dais where the new fall queen would be crowned. The gold sash from years past hung over the edge of the table, and beside it lay a small wooden tiara box, its paint chipping at the edges. "Still fits," Maisie said dryly, catching Jessica's glance. "Though the girls these days prefer social media crowns to wooden ones." Jessica smiled. "It's a lovely tradition." "Tradition," Maisie echoed, adjusting a bouquet with practiced hands. "Funny how it always seems to serve the same people." Jessica stepped closer. "You've chaired this event for over a decade. It must feel strange with Lydia back." Maisie didn't respond immediately. Her hands paused on the edge of the box. "She was always the story everyone watched. I was just the footnote." Jessica watched her. "But you were fall queen once too." Maisie's expression tightened. "Because her father insisted she not compete that year, said it would conflict with their family's image. That's what he called it." "And now?" Jessica asked softly. Maisie looked up. "Now she's gone, and the crown still doesn't fit right." Jessica lingered beside the dais, the faint rustle of ribbons accompanying the quiet between her and Maisie. The breeze had picked up, scattering leaves across the pavilion floor. "You were close in age," Jessica said gently. Maisie nodded, her voice low. "We were in the same year, shared a locker once." She had this air, like she was always one page ahead in a book only she could read. Jessica folded her arms. Did you ever confront her about what happened with the contest? No, Maisie said. What would I say? That I knew she wasn't competing because someone made a deal behind closed doors, that my crown came with pity. She looked away. People think being overlooked is better than being rejected, but it leaves its own scar. You start wondering if you ever really stood on your own. Jessica observed her, reading not just the words but the weight behind them, and when she came back, Maisie's smile was tight. She apologized, said it was silly. Ancient history, she called it. Then tried to recruit me for her land rebranding committee like none of it ever happened. She underestimated what stayed with you, Jessica murmured. Maisie didn't answer, but her eyes, shimmering with something unshed, did. Jessica didn't press further. Not yet, but she knew now the wound hadn't just reopened with Lydia's return. It had never truly closed. The harvest hall smelled of fresh pine garland and wood polish. Jessica entered just as a group of volunteers were pinning the final orange bunting along the stage where the parade winners would be announced later that afternoon. Somewhere outside, the faint blare of a brass band warming up drifted in on a crisp breeze. In the far corner, a long table had been set up with photo albums and framed memories, a tribute to festivals past. Jessica wandered toward it, drawn as much by habit as curiosity. Black and white snapshots, color Polaroids, and newspaper clippings were arranged in uneven rows, each labeled with handwritten captions: Fall Queen 1959, Scarecrow Winners 1974, Apple Bobbing Champion, undated. She studied the faces, some round with youth, others lined by time. It was a charming display, meant to stir nostalgia, yet as her eyes scanned the older photos, Jessica noticed something else, a quiet undercurrent in the way certain images had been positioned. One frame near the back had no label at all, just a curling photograph of two teenagers, one unmistakably Lydia Canfield, smiling beside a boy Jessica didn't recognize. The photo felt misplaced, or perhaps purposefully forgotten. Jessica reached for the photograph, careful not to smudge the aged corners. The image was slightly faded, but Lydia's face was unmistakable, youthful, with the same sharp eyes and self-possessed tilt of the head. But it was the boy beside her who drew Jessica's attention. He looked no more than 17, his arm draped casually around Lydia's shoulder. His smile was easy, unguarded, his face unfamiliar. What puzzled her more was the absence of any name beneath the photo. Every other picture had been carefully labeled, even those from decades earlier, but not this one. Jessica turned it over. The back was blank save for a faint pencil mark, 1974. She looked again at the boy's face. There was something in it, something haunting in its openness. A volunteer passed nearby, arms full of pennants. Jessica gently tapped her arm. "Excuse me," she asked. "Do you know who this is?" The woman glanced briefly and shrugged. "That's Lydia, sure, but I don't know the boy. Maybe someone from out of town." Jessica nodded politely, though something inside her disagreed. This wasn't just a forgotten face. It was someone meant to be erased. And suddenly, she knew who might remember. Nora Bell answered the library door with her cardigan sleeves rolled up and her eyes tired, as if the day had stretched longer than she'd planned. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Jessica said gently. Nora shook her head. "Come in." Jessica held out the photograph. "Do you recognize him?" Nora took the photo, and for a moment the librarian in her surfaced, fingers brushing delicately along the edge, careful not to crease the print. But then her gaze landed on the boy's face. She stopped breathing. Jessica saw it immediately, the stiffening of her posture, the faint tremble in her fingers. "Where did you find this?" Nora asked quietly. "In the harvest hall, among the display." Nora looked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Thomas." Jessica remained still. "My brother," Nora said, "the year before he died." A silence followed, long and heavy. "No one's shown me that photo in over 40 years, Nora added. "Most people pretend it never existed." "Did Lydia ever speak of him after?" "No," Nora said flatly. "Not once. Not to me. Not to anyone." Jessica waited. The past had not merely returned, it had knocked on the door, photograph in hand, and now it refused to leave. They sat in the library's reading nook, the photograph laid between them like an unspoken verdict. "He died on the old mill bridge," Nora said, voice steady now, as though rehearsed over years of quiet. "It was raining. The official story was that he slipped." Jessica said nothing, allowing the air between them to fill naturally. "But it never made sense," Nora continued. "Thomas didn't drink, he wasn't reckless, and he had a habit of writing things down, things that weren't meant to be written." Jessica looked up. "Like what?" "Land discrepancies. Conversations overheard at Canfield Orchard. Lydia's father was planning a development, something that would have cost families their homes. Thomas had a list. Did you ever see it?" "No, it disappeared the same week he died." Jessica reached for the photograph again. "And Lydia, she was with him earlier that day. I saw them talking behind the old cider barn. It was heated. She was crying." Nora stared out the library window now, her voice thin. "I think she knew something, or saw something. But after Thomas died, she vanished. College in Boston, then Europe, no funeral, no note." Jessica's hand rested on the photo. Some absences, she thought, echo louder than words. Back on the festival green, children had gathered under a white canopy, chattering as they painted pumpkins in bright oranges, reds, and purples. Jessica walked slowly past, her mind still dwelling on Nora's words. A girl accidentally dropped her brush and giggled as she retrieved it, leaving a smear of blue on the grass. Jessica paused. There was something in the photo, a detail her mind had filed away, but hadn't fully processed. She retrieved it from her handbag, and studied it again beneath the filtered light of the tent. There, on the hem of Lydia's dress, faint but undeniable, a smudge of black paint. In the photo, she had been wearing a light-colored dress, white, possibly cream. The dark streak stood out, if one looked closely. It didn't match the other elements of the picture. Lydia was otherwise neat, composed. Jessica glanced again at the pumpkin table. Black paint wasn't common. Children avoided it, unless specifically told to use it. Too stark, too messy. Had they been painting something that day, or marking something? She didn't yet know why it mattered, only that it did. Because Lydia hadn't just been with Thomas that day, she'd been marked by it. The old mill bridge stood half forgotten at the edge of town, beyond the apple orchards, and past the hollow where the festival lanterns no longer reached. Jessica walked there alone, guided more by instinct than purpose. The wood beneath her shoes was soft with age, moss threading through the boards, and the stream below ran clear but cold. She paused at the midpoint, and let the quiet settle around her. It was not hard to imagine it. A young man, rain falling, the weight of something unspeakable on his conscience. Perhaps he came here to think. Perhaps he never meant to fall, or perhaps someone ensured he did. Jessica looked down into the shallow water. Stones glimmered beneath the surface. Leaves floated like silent witnesses. A small plaque, almost obscured by ivy, was nailed to the bridge post. In memory of Thomas Bell, 1956-1974. No ceremony, no flourish, just a name and a date. She reached out and brushed the ivy aside, revealing a single carved word beneath truth. Jessica stepped back. It wasn't official, not part of the plaque. Carved by hand, quiet, private. Perhaps Nora, or perhaps someone else still mourning. The breeze picked up. Jessica turned slowly to leave. Some stories didn't need headlines to echo. They only needed one place and one soul to carry them. And now the silence had begun to stir again. The sheriff's office was dimly lit, a half-drunk cup of coffee cooling beside a stack of unread reports. Jessica stood by the window, watching dusk bleed across the orchard fields. "I've gone over it a dozen times," Sheriff Coulter said, rubbing his temples. "Everything points to an accident." Jessica turned, hands folded. "Unless the pieces don't fit because we're using the wrong puzzle." He gave her a look, not dismissive, but tired. "You think someone killed her?" "I think someone wanted something covered up," she replied. "And Lydia had a habit of uncovering things. You said the scarf caught in the press, but she wasn't wearing it the night before. Why would she put it on just before dawn?" He hesitated. "Could have grabbed it on her way out. Could have been cold." Jessica stepped forward. "And if someone placed it after the fact?" Coulter was silent. "Then we've got no evidence of that. Yet," he sighed. "I'll give you this much, Mrs. Fletcher. I never did like how neat it all seemed. Nothing in this town's ever been neat." Jessica nodded. She didn't need confirmation. She only needed space for the truth to breathe. And it was starting to inhale. Sleep came slowly, so Jessica didn't wait for it. Instead, she wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped out into the moonlight, her footsteps muffled by the orchard's soft loam. The air smelled of ripening apples and memory, sweet, heavy and sharp around the edges. The trees formed dark silhouettes against the silver-lit sky, their branches arched like old shoulders bent beneath the weight of forgotten truths. Jessica walked slowly, thinking not just of Lydia, but of the town that had both welcomed her back and refused her peace. Each encounter replayed itself: Nora's hesitation, Glenn's carefully measured words, Maisie's wounded pride. Lydia had been trying to reclaim something. Land, yes, but perhaps more than that. Redemption, maybe. Or control. And someone hadn't wanted her to succeed. Jessica paused by a wooden fence, the moon catching on a glint of metal, an old horseshoe nailed to a post. For luck perhaps, or superstition. She didn't believe in either, but she did believe in patterns, and something about this town was circling, not just grief, but guilt. And somewhere in this orchard, someone else had been awake that morning, watching, or acting. Jessica continued forward, listening for the whisper that hadn't yet spoken. She saw him before he noticed her, a quiet silhouette seated on a low stump near the oldest apple tree, where the ground sloped slightly, and the moonlight fell in ribbons. Glenn Hartley, shoulders hunched, hands clasped, head bowed in thought. Jessica approached without hurry, the leaves crunching just enough to announce her. "You always sit out here in the middle of the night?" she asked gently. Glenn looked up, surprised but not startled. "Sometimes, helps me think." She didn't sit, but remained close enough for conversation, hands resting on the curve of the fence rail. "You've been thinking a lot lately," she said, "and carrying something." Glenn said nothing. Jessica waited, giving him the kind of silence that invited truth rather than demanded it. "I didn't do anything," he said at last. "Not to her. I didn't hurt her." "But you saw something," Jessica said. He exhaled, long and slow. "I didn't want to get dragged into it. Everyone in this town has their own version of history. Mine wasn't welcome." Jessica's voice was soft. "Sometimes what we see isn't just ours to carry, it belongs to the person who can no longer speak." Glenn nodded, slowly. And then, finally he began. "She was already there when I arrived," Glenn said, voice low. I couldn't sleep, walked the orchard path before sunrise. It's a habit. Jessica listened, each word carefully measured in her mind. I saw Lydia near the cider press. She wasn't alone at first. There was someone else, couldn't see their face. But they were arguing. I heard the tone before I heard the words. What time was this? Jessica asked. Just before 5, he said. Too early for deliveries, too late for lanterns. Did she see you? No. I stayed back. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I'd only be adding fuel to old fires. Jessica studied him. And when you walked past again, she was on the ground, he said, after a long pause. The scarf, it was caught. I panicked, thought maybe it was an accident, but something didn't look right. He nodded. It looked arranged. That's what scared me most. Jessica's eyes held his. And you didn't tell anyone? I couldn't prove anything. And after everything she did, or didn't do, I thought maybe it was just fate. Jessica didn't answer immediately, because what he described wasn't guilt, but it was something close. You didn't kill her, Glenn, Jessica said softly, but you left the truth out in the cold. Glenn shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want to accuse the wrong person. I didn't even know who I'd be accusing. Jessica moved closer, her voice steady. You didn't have to name them. Just the fact that someone was there, that's not nothing. He rubbed his hands together. This town eats its own, Jessica. You know that by now. I saw what happened to Thomas Bell, and Nora, and even Maisie in her own way. Silence becomes protection, until it doesn't. She let his words settle, knowing he wasn't wrong, not entirely. But silence can also create shadows where truth should be, she said. And in those shadows, it's easy for guilt to shift. Glenn looked up. You think someone used that silence? I think someone counted on it. Jessica looked toward the horizon where the barn stood quiet against the trees. What you saw could shift the timeline, she said. And the motive. I didn't mean for her to die, Glenn whispered. No, Jessica said. But sometimes meaning nothing and doing nothing end up in the same place. And now she feared they were standing in it. Glenn remained seated as Jessica stepped away, her thoughts moving faster than her feet. The orchard stretched before her like a half-remembered dream, quiet, tangled, restless. As she reached the bend in the path near the cider barn, something caught her eye. A lantern, one of the handmade ones from the children's parade, flickering softly on a hook beside the door. It hadn't been there earlier. Jessica approached slowly. The flame inside danced low, as though it had been lit long ago and forgotten, or perhaps not forgotten at all. She stood before it for a long moment, listening. The barn door was closed, the night was still, but something about the scene tugged at her, a quiet staging, as if someone had come back, retraced a step, rehearsed a memory, a place where an argument may have ended, or begun. She reached out, gently steadying the lantern, as the wind picked up, but didn't extinguish the flame. Then she turned and walked back toward the orchard, her mind pulling threads, quiet and steady. There was still a story here, and someone, somewhere, had left just enough light behind to be followed. The judge's table had been cleared of most of the entries, but a few sample displays remained, decorative reminders of the festival's culinary pride. Jessica, lingering behind the others, let her eyes wander across the remnants, half-sliced pies, empty tart shells, folded napkins, and among them, a small glass bottle. Maple syrup. It was nothing unusual at first glance. Amber gold, sealed with twine and a scalloped paper tag. But when Jessica picked it up, her gaze narrowed. The label read, Stillwater Hollow Farm, grade a dark amber. She frowned. Stillwater Hollow had shuttered last spring, She remembered hearing about it during a conversation with Mayor Ellison. The Canfields had opposed their final expansion attempt, citing land encroachment. And Lydia had spoken at that zoning hearing, sternly, publicly. Jessica turned the bottle over in her hands. The syrup was real, thick, beautifully crafted. But its presence, unlabeled in the contest, tucked behind other jars, felt deliberate. Someone had brought it here. Quietly, recently. She set the bottle down, her mind already spinning. The syrup wasn't just sweet, it was out of place. And in a murder, that was the first whisper of truth. Jessica wandered to the edge of the green, where the children were packing up their painted pumpkins. Maggie Dean, the young girl who'd helped organize the lantern walk, was carefully placing brushes back into their tins. "Busy morning?" Jessica asked, crouching beside her. Maggie grinned. "Always is after the contest. People leave everything behind." Jessica picked up a small mason jar, including syrup. "Oh yeah, I helped carry some yesterday. Extra bottles and things for the tasting table. Glenn said the judges might want backups." Jessica tilted her head. "Glenn Hartley?" Maggie nodded. "He had them boxed. Told me to leave a few in the kitchen tent. I dropped one on the table too, the one with the pretty tag." Jessica's breath caught gently. "Did he say where it was from?" Maggie shrugged. "Just local stock. Said the label didn't matter." But it did matter. Jessica stood slowly, offering Maggie a warm thank you. Glenn hadn't lied, not precisely. But omitting the source of the syrup, especially one Lydia had publicly condemned, wasn't a casual oversight. It was shielding or avoidance. And Jessica, who knew the weight of silence all too well, recognized both. Jessica returned to the cider barn path, her mind assembling the moments like puzzle pieces with frayed edges. Glenn had placed the syrup. Maggie confirmed it, likely the evening before the judging, which meant Lydia had seen it when she reviewed the entries. She was known to be meticulous, especially where reputations were involved. Jessica thought back to that night, the way Lydia had walked away from the bonfire, her jaw clenched, her silence heavier than words. The confrontation with Glenn earlier, the flicker of something unspoken between them. Lydia had likely recognized the Stillwater label. She would have known its presence could be used to embarrass Glenn, or worse, imply hypocrisy. And if she confronted him that morning, Jessica stopped at the edge of the trees, the place where Glenn said he saw her near the press. What if that confrontation hadn't been calm? What if Lydia, proud and precise, demanded answers, and Glenn, cornered by shame or fear, lashed out, not with intent, but with heat, with humiliation? Jessica looked up at the press, at the coiled metal and darkened wood. Even an accidental death, if concealed, becomes something else entirely, something unforgivable. The image formed slowly in Jessica's mind, not as a dramatized scene, but a quiet recollection of character and motive. Lydia wakes early. Perhaps restless, perhaps determined. She walks the green and arrives at the contest tent, where she notices the Stillwater bottle. Frowns, reads the label, connects it to the man who once proposed to her and whom she publicly dismissed. She walks the orchard path, finds him near the barn, or by the press. Jessica could imagine Lydia's tone. Sharp, accusatory, not theatrical but cutting in that elegant surgical way that had left many in town bruised over the years. And Glenn, perhaps already emotionally strained, replies defensively. Perhaps he tries to justify it. "It was just syrup," he says. "You've made enough enemies without dragging me into your war." A pause. Lydia turns, fed up. Then something shifts. A gesture, a reach, perhaps even just a shove to reclaim space. A stumble, a moment of imbalance on slick morning ground. The scarf, either already in her hand or yanked in panic, catches in the gear. Jessica closes her eyes. No plan, no premeditation. But when Glenn sees the aftermath, fear overtakes reason. He steps back, leaves, tells himself it was too late. But later he returns, maybe to move her, maybe to fix what can't be fixed, and places the scarf as a cover, not a killer, but no longer innocent. And in Apple Hollow, that distinction was everything. Jessica's final stop that afternoon was the now quiet syrup stand. The wooden crates were half empty, the sign crooked from wind. A young woman behind the table, Ruth, if Jessica recalled correctly, was scribbling in a spiral-bound ledger. "Afternoon," Jessica said kindly. "Mind if I ask a question?" Ruth looked up. "Of course, Mrs. Fletcher." Jessica pointed to the bottle she'd seen earlier. "Do you have any syrup from Stillwater Hollow?" Ruth blinked. "No, ma'am. They closed last year. We only use Hollow Ridge and Bennett Farms." "Any chance Glenn Hartley donated bottles?" She shook her head. "Not that I know of. He bought some last week, but didn't donate. Paid cash." Jessica smiled faintly. "You keep good records." Ruth glanced down. "I try. Most folks just sign their name." Jessica leaned closer and read the latest entry. "G. Hartley, 2 bottles, Stillwater label, paid cash." The line was neatly underlined. She thanked Ruth and stepped back into the breeze. The syrup hadn't come from the festival stockpile. Glenn had brought it in himself. No crime in that. But the concealment. It was deliberate. And deliberate acts, in moments of chaos, leave trails deeper than footprints. Jessica stood beneath the arbor where the lanterns had once been strung, her eyes fixed on the cider barn in the distance. Afternoon sun filtered through the trees, warm against her shoulders, but her thoughts remained cool and focused. She could see it clearly now, not with satisfaction, but with quiet inevitability. Glenn hadn't meant to harm Lydia, but shame has a peculiar weight, one that presses down not only on what we've done, but what we've failed to undo. He had tried to keep his distance, hidden the syrup to avoid conflict, avoided admitting the confrontation, allowed silence to stand in place of truth. But Lydia had been a mirror, not gentle, not forgiving. She reflected the parts of people they most wished to forget, and in Glenn's case, she'd seen what he tried hardest to conceal. Jessica took a breath and exhaled slowly. She would speak to him again. Not to accuse, but to offer clarity, the kind that sometimes comes too late, but still carries meaning, because Glenn Hartley wasn't a murderer, but someone had died in his presence, and he had let the lie settle like dust. She turned toward the barn. The story wasn't over, but at last she had a name for the silence, and it was his. Dusk crept gently over Apple Hollow, settling in long shadows beneath the maple trees and brushing gold across the rooftops. The air was tinged with the sweet scent of cider and wood smoke, but the usual hum of festival cheer was softened, as if the town had collectively chosen to speak in whispers. Jessica walked slowly past the stalls, many now packed away or left half dismantled. Children clustered near the lantern tables, giggling quietly as they dipped wicks into bowls of wax. The glow of the paper lanterns began to shimmer to life, one by one, like cautious stars emerging after a storm. She nodded to Nora Bell, who stood near the quilt tent, hands folded tightly over her stomach. Glenn Hartley passed by, not noticing Jessica, or perhaps pretending not to. His shoulders were hunched inwards, his steps oddly careful, as though trying not to disturb the ground he walked on. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a hush, the kind born not from fear, but from something older, heavier, grief. Jessica paused near the cider press, where the gears had long since stilled. Apple Hollow had always prized its silence, but tonight it spoke volumes. Sheriff Coulter was already waiting near the cider barn, his hat in one hand, the other resting on the curved wood of the press. He looked up as Jessica approached, his expression unreadable but softened by time and fatigue. "We've filed the report as accidental," he said quietly. "I'll note the inconsistencies in the private record, but I won't drag anyone through a courtroom unless they force my hand." Jessica nodded slowly. "It's not the kind of justice that leaves everyone satisfied." "No." He looked out across the field, where lanterns glowed like distant embers. "But it's the kind that lets this town keep breathing." They stood in silence for a long moment. "He's carrying it," Jessica said softly, "and I suspect he always will. That may be more punishment than anything the law could impose." Coulter didn't argue. He simply nodded, then added, "You were right to follow the syrup." Jessica gave a faint smile. "It always starts with something small." As she turned to leave, he touched her arm lightly. "Thank you, Jess." For once she didn't offer a wise reply, only a glance that said what words couldn't. And then she stepped into the growing dark. Near the edge of the reflecting pond, lanterns floated in shallow baskets, waiting for the moment of release. Jessica lingered there, half listening to the soft voices of children rehearsing lines for the closing blessing. Then she saw them. Glenn Hartley and Maisie Trumbull stood a few feet apart, facing each other, yet not quite meeting eyes. Maisie clutched a small shawl, likely Lydia's, Jessica thought, her knuckles white against the faded wool. Glenn's hands were empty, but his stance bore the awkwardness of a man unsure if he should step closer or walk away entirely. He bowed his head, just slightly. A breath, a silent offering. Maisie didn't speak, but her expression shifted, not toward forgiveness, not yet, but toward something quieter. The raw edge of blame dulled into something like understanding. She reached forward and gently laid the shawl on the bench between them. Then she walked away. Glenn remained, staring at the bench, the fabric folded like memory. Jessica, unseen in the twilight, turned back toward the lantern path. No confession had been spoken, no pardon granted, but some things pass between people not in words, only in weight shared. The sky had deepened into lavender by the time the procession reached the water. The children led the way, each holding a glowing lantern cradled between small, careful hands. Behind them came the elders, the volunteers, the quiet-hearted, those who had always held the town together, not by noise but by presence. Jessica stood slightly apart, watching as each lantern was placed upon the surface of the pond and nudged gently forward. The water caught their reflections, sending ripples of light across the dark. The ceremony had no speeches this year, only the hush of moving feet, the soft tap of wood against stone, the occasional sniffle muffled into a scarf. As the lanterns drifted outward, Jessica let her thoughts settle. Apple Hollow had revealed itself slowly, like peeling bark or old wallpaper, layer by layer, until the hidden wood showed through. Beneath the pie contests and scarecrow ribbons, beneath the cider smiles and maple booths, there had been old pain, buried too long, mourned too late. She thought of Lydia, proud, brittle, never one for softness, and of Glenn, too human for hate, too weak for honesty, and of Nora still guarding her brother's memory like an unopened letter. The lanterns floated on, delicate and determined. Communities are like that, Jessica mused. They carry the light, but they also carry the shadows, and sometimes, in forgiving neither fully, they survive. Morning mist clung gently to the train platform as Jessica stood beside her suitcase, gloved hands folded over the handle, The station master gave a courteous nod, tipping his cap with the reverence reserved for those who had, somehow, touched the town without disturbing it too deeply. Mayor Ellison arrived with a box of late apples and a paper bag of pastries. From the festival committee, he said. They didn't quite know what to say. Jessica smiled, touched. This is more than enough. You gave folks a way to understand, he added quietly, even if they're not ready to talk about it. I just followed what was already there, Jessica said. It was Apple Hollow that showed me. As the whistle called from down the tracks, she stepped forward, shaking his hand. Her thoughts lingered not on the mystery solved, but on what remained unresolved, the griefs not aired, the apologies unsaid, the quiet endurance of people who'd built their lives beside a wound. Some truths don't heal, they just become part of the map, and that too was a kind of justice. As the train arrived, Jessica climbed aboard, heart full but still listening, always listening. The compartment was warm, the rhythm of the train soothing in its predictability. Jessica reached into her handbag and withdrew the envelope she'd been given the night before, passed to her by Nora Bell, who had found it tucked inside an old library book, returned decades late. The handwriting was unmistakably Lydia's, addressed to no one and everyone. Jessica opened it slowly. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were sharp. A draft of a letter, unsent, perhaps unmeant to be sent. I never said goodbye to Thomas. I don't know how. I don't know if I'm allowed to. I wish I could ask him what he remembered. I wish someone had. Jessica read the lines twice, then folded the letter back into its envelope. Some regrets live quiet lives in drawers and attics. Others echo in festivals and names on plaques. Lydia had carried hers without softness, and it had weighed her down all the same. Jessica watched the trees slip past the window, golden with early fall. Whatever might have been said or forgiven now belonged to memory. But even memories sometimes hold enough truth for a kind of peace. Sometimes the heart of a small town beats loudest in the silence left behind, in the words unspoken, and the letters never sent. But here's a question worth pondering. Was the true harm done by the act itself, or by the years of silence that followed? I'd love to know what you think. Share your thoughts or theories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with me, feel free to like the video, pass it along to a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe for more stories where the truth waits quietly, just beneath the surface.